All right, thanks for joining us for episode 24 of the Webinational Webinar Marketing Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about something that a lot of us probably have experience with, which is live presentations. I know that I've done a lot of live presentations in the past, not maybe in the way that you would think of a live presentation, but I've certainly done them. And how do they apply, or how do they compare with what we're doing in a webinar? So when we're talking about a webinar, maybe that's something new for you. Okay. We'll reboot there. All right, we're here with Webinational Webinar Marketing Podcast, episode 24 today. We're going to be talking about something that a lot of us have experience with, which is live presentations, meaning in-person, traditional speaking presentations that almost all of us have done in some way, and then comparing that to a webinar presentation. What are the pros and the cons? What are the differences? How can you take what you've done in your past presenting, speaking experience and apply that to a webinar? So if you're doing webinars now, if you're already doing webinars, which a lot of people are, then you probably have some experience with the differences between the two. They're certainly different in terms of the speaking. Why? What the holy cats? All right, I'm going to do this a third time. I don't know what's going on. And this is Webinational Webinar Marketing Podcast, episode 24 from Webinational.com. My name is Joe Daniel. As I believe I said already in the intro, this is the third time that I've started this podcast, so I'm a little off already. So we'll see what happens with it here. We're going to be talking about presentations and live presentations compared to doing a webinar. So what's the difference? What are the similarities? How can you take experience that you already have doing live presentations and apply that to your webinar presentations? Now, we know that webinars have some advantages. There are also some disadvantages to doing a live presentation. There's certainly pros and cons to each. I'm also doing this, it'll be on YouTube, so if you're listening on the podcast, then I am recording this and going to put it up on YouTube as well, and someone I'll play with. I don't have a whole lot of things to draw or anything for this one. You know, if we do like the sales funnel episode, it would have been nice to have done this so I could have drawn my little sales funnel that I had on my paper here. This is what I have to work off of. I started doing this for my football coaching podcast just to see what would happen, and it's gotten good response. And also, it's just another way to be everywhere. So when you're talking about if you're doing a podcast, this is now going to be a YouTube video too. I don't know that anybody's going to watch it, but if you watch me for 30 minutes, that's sitting here talking, I can see how that'd be thrilling for you. My beautiful studio here, 8x8 room with the blue sheet over the window, trying to cut out a little bit of the backlight. Football plays up on the board. I think there may be some trash. We're in the middle of some moving. Pretty exciting. I had a lot of experience giving live presentations before I started doing webinars, but not in the way that you probably think. I've never been a speaker in that I've never been asked to come speak to a large group of people. But I was a teacher for 10 years, so I did a lot of speaking. I spoke to my students every day, and it doesn't feel necessarily like you're giving a presentation, but you are. I mean, like we've talked about before, everybody's selling. You're selling something. So when I was teaching, I got to sell these kids that this stuff's important. I got to tell them, you got to test on it. That's one. Two, just a part of life is knowing stuff and being smart and impressing people with your knowledge. And teaching history, and you talk about history repeats itself. So you're selling the kids on this stuff, and then you have to make it interesting and engaging, or 16-year-old will turn you off in a heartbeat. They'll start writing notes. Girls are over there drawing, writing their name with their boyfriend's last name 100 times, different handwriting in their notebook. They're writing long letters to each other. They have notebooks they pass back and forth. It's just they have a million. Now they're sitting there texting. And they're doing everything. So they'll find a way to ignore you. Not that different from a webinar, because when you deliver a webinar, you know that person's sitting at their computer and they can very easily just switch off and go, surf the web and look at. I'm just going to pull the audio from this. I'm trying to record this in Audacity and it keeps shutting off on me, which is not a normal problem. Keep stopping at 1 minute, 3 seconds. I don't know what's happening. So I'll just hopefully get all the audio off of YouTube. So the audio may not be as crisp here. Oh well. Your presentations, when you give a live presentation, are well prepared, just like your webinar. The differences, the pros and the cons, I'm throwing off now. Teaching was a presentation every day, 180 days a year, 3 or 4 presentations every day. We were on a block schedule, so we had like 3 or 4 classes every day. We had 1 class every day, and then other classes here and there. So since 2002, I've been doing live presentations, and then before that, of course, as a student, you sometimes have to give presentations in class. If you have experience, whether it's presenting to a committee at work or presenting to a board, or just anything that you've done where you've used presentations, done a presentation, you shouldn't abandon all that when you go to deliver a webinar. You should have hopefully learned from those different presentations and take them to your webinar. So you've got a good idea of what will capture people's attention. And then, going back to teaching, it's just like any other presentation that you give. Nobody's forced to listen to you. And if you've done more than a couple presentations, that if people don't want to listen, they just shut you out. And you can tell the difference. So you go back and you look at the things that worked and the things that didn't, and draw on those experiences. It's going to be the same in your webinars. The things that work are going to work, and the things that don't won't work. But now we're talking about selling for your business here. So whatever your product is, we're going to talk about the pros and cons selling for your business. I think the first one, the most obvious pro of a webinar compared to a live presentation, is the cost. Clearly, even if you're paying for the big package, the 1,000-person package on GoToWebinar. So if you're on GoToWebinar, you've got 1,000 people. I think it's $4.99 right now a month. That's expensive, but with 1,000 people in there, again, if you got a $10 product and you convert 10 people, it doesn't take that much to cash out of that. If you've got 1,000 people, if you don't have 1,000, then you shouldn't have the 1,000-person plan. If you got over 500, you should. But when you're starting out, you may just be on the 100-person plan. I'm on Webinar Jam. I'm actually recording this on Webinar Jam through a Google Hangout right now. I wanted to have a couple of the other little tools available to me, so it's being recorded that way as well. So I use Webinar Jam, and I think it's a great service, and I think Webinar Jam is, we'll go ahead and I think Webinar Jam right now, and I'm looking it up, is like $4.99 a month, or $4.99 for $4.97. It's crossed out. 40% off today of the $4.97. I don't know if that's unlimited. I don't know if that's forever or for a year, but 40% off today. This is August 29th. They always have some kind of special going on, so check back with them. And I love it. I'm getting all these pop-ups and stuff. I think it's a great tool to use. So I use it all the time. Using Webinar Jam, using free stuff, you're using any meeting, whatever you're using to get on there. It's cheaper than an actual live presentation. So take travel costs. Let's start there. Even if you did it in your hometown, you got to pay for gas. But I was going to do a presentation. It ended up falling through. I was going to do one in Atlanta. So I was going to either have to drive or fly to Atlanta. I would drive, get a hotel, and then it was going to be something like $500 for the room, and the room held 25 people. Okay. Now, obviously, I would charge for that type of presentation. I would charge for people to be there, but it's a completely different setup there. With the cost of a Google Hangout, or with the cost, yeah, Google Hangout, what you can do for free, and you just got to find a system to get people in there, like Webinar Jam. The cost is much, much lower, which means that I can afford to bring people in for free, and so that's a definite advantage. Another advantage, I don't think it's intimidating. Maybe it is a little bit. Even my first podcasts were intimidating. I used to do interview podcasts, and I was kind of nervous talking with somebody on the interview the first couple times. But if you're nervous about presenting in public, you can sit behind your computer and present for a webinar, and maybe it's not as intimidating for you. So that may be a second advantage. So first advantage, cost. Second advantage is not as intimidating. The third one is you can be really flexible with your scheduling. I can put a webinar. I can decide to do a webinar. I'm recording this on Friday. I can decide to do a webinar on Sunday. Truthfully, I can decide to do it on tomorrow or tonight. Send out an email to my mailing list and have a crowd there, have an audience there for that webinar. Something I've considered doing actually is just maybe not necessarily a full-blown webinar, but maybe just send it out to, say, site members and say, hey, I'm going to be on Google Hangouts for the next hour starting at 3 o'clock. And if you have questions, you want to come on, you want to talk, be there, we'll do it, we'll record it, and see what we get, see what happens. So very flexible in your scheduling. Obviously, if you're going to be doing a live presentation, you're going to need to book a venue, you're going to need to book your travel plans, people that are coming are going to need to start booking their rooms, they're going to make their travel plans. Something comes up, they're not going to be able to make it, that's it, it's over, it's done, they can't go. So flexibility is a big advantage of webinars. So cost, it's easier to not be intimidated by doing a webinar. It's flexible. Because it's flexible and cheap, I think you can attract some fringe audience. When we talk about a live presentation, people really have to be all in on that particular topic. They have to be committed to paying, even if you're doing it for free. They've got to take, again, the travel, they've got to take time out of their day, all this sort of stuff. They've got to show up in person. It's a lot more of a commitment. It's a full commitment. I'm sitting there in the room with you. And so it's somebody who's already into it. To whereas I think, let's say we're doing a webinar on webinars. Let's say, I'm doing one of my webinars on how to create a great webinar. And somebody who's maybe iffy on whether or not they want to do this, they've got a business, but they're not positive they want to use webinars. They just want to see what it's about. They know that if they don't like the webinar, they can just click out of it. It's free. They can let it play in the background while they're surfing on the internet, looking at stuff all over the place. So I think you can get a little fringe audience, and you may not love that fringe audience. I go back to my football coaching stuff. I'm not a huge fan of people who are just football fans coming onto the site. That's not my. It's not that I don't want them. I'm not going to sell them anything. I'm not that interested in them. So, but you might get one who comes on and looks at it and says, you know what, this is really interesting, and they might become a football coach. So I don't have a big problem with it. I'm looking at the webcam feed here, and my bald, shining head is dotted with sweat. So there we go. Maybe I'm nervous, or it's these lights too. I got lights on. So I think you can get a fringe audience in there. I think that it's great for webinars that you can do a shorter presentation. I think if people are going to show up to a live presentation, you're going to need to really present in, not necessarily in depth, may not even be the word, but longer. It's going to need to be extended out. You're going to need to talk, maybe hit several topics, or hit something so deeply that only people who are really, really, really into it would want it. Webinar, we're talking a 45-minute presentation. We're talking something that's just slightly longer, or depending on how long this goes, maybe just like this podcast. So I could do a webinar about using your live presentation skills in a webinar, okay? And it's 45 minutes of presentation, but I can drill down deeply into one particular topic or I can overview a few things, but it's shorter. You're not going to get a bunch of people to show up to watch a 45-minute presentation, but they will for a webinar, and they prefer that. People really do, especially in the case of a free webinar. They don't want to sit for 12 hours and watch a presentation. You know, they're on their computer. The butt gets sore. Mine would. I'm now. I've only been sitting here for 20 minutes. Dropbox deleted all. If you ever release a virtual assistant, unshare your Dropbox folder first, because not maliciously, but they will want their space in their Dropbox back, and so they will delete your files from their Dropbox, and it will delete yours. Luckily, you can get them back. Little side tip. So shorter presentations, you've got that fringe audience. I think you're going to get a larger audience. You can certainly, you're limited unless you really pay for something big. You know, you got a stadium or something that's different. But if we're talking about, like I said, 25-person room for $500 or $500 for 1,000 people that can be in your webinar. So you're going to be able to cater to a larger audience in the case of a webinar. I think that you can record and distribute your webinars cheaply. You can I take my webinars and I repurpose them as membership content. You can take your webinars and repurpose them as link bait. So not link bait, opt-in bait. So I can put that out there. I can take this webinar and record it and put it as later on, say, hey, if you want to watch this webinar, just put your email here. And that's something I'm probably going to do with one of my past webinars, which has so many great ideas. I have like a list of stuff over here. It's not my first time with that idea. I just keep forgetting to do it. Keep forgetting to put that up. So you could, and it's cheap. I mean, it doesn't take anything. Like I said, I'm doing this video right now while I'm recording this podcast. I'm also doing it on Google Hangouts. Google Hangouts is recording it and posting it to YouTube. And it would do the same thing, and it does the same thing when I do a webinar, because I do mine through Webinar Jam. And there's a lot of other, there's very free ways, because of Google Hangouts, there's very free ways to do webinars now. It's just a matter of how you collect the opt-ins, how you collect their emails, all that sort of stuff that goes with it. And the last thing is, as far as the pros, it's not the last pro, it's the last one I'm going to talk about. Your question and answer with your customers can be anonymous, and I think there may be a little bit more open to asking questions and to getting involved when they don't have to necessarily raise their hand in a room full of strangers to ask their questions. So another thing that can potentially be valuable for you is that people are going to be more willing to ask a question of you and to give you feedback with your webinars, and really immediate feedback. I think you'll definitely get feedback in a live audience, but I don't know if it's always going to be 100% genuine. I think if somebody, either way, I think if somebody thinks it sucks, they're just going to disappear. So you're not going to get, hey, that was terrible, or you know what you should have done? You won't get much of that, but I think you'll get more feedback, more questions maybe, sometimes with your webinars. Now, webinars aren't everything. I love live presentations. I have not done a lot of live presentations to groups. I've done some football clinics, speaking, but most of it, in fact, I made a mistake. And this is again a comparison. I made a mistake with the very first webinar that I did. The very first webinar that I did, I set it up because I was going to be doing my first live clinic presentation, live in person. A packed room of 12 showed up, I think. I was like, you ever been to any sort of convention? The last speaker in the last time slot in the back room, there's like 5 people speaking. I'm the only one who nobody's ever heard of other than people who've been to my website, and I think 2 of the people in the room were friends of mine. Well, a few days before that, I wanted to practice that presentation. And I think I was backwards, first of all. I think the webinars are much more valuable. But I was nervous about the first presentation. So I used the exact same PowerPoint slides and everything and did my first webinar. Now, I wasn't wrong because I got out there and I did the webinar. And it's still on my website for my members. But I was wrong because the presentation that you use in your live is different than what you use in your webinar. Okay. In your webinar, this is a con of doing a webinar. So this is the disadvantage of webinars compared to a live presentation. In a live presentation, you have body language, you have facial expressions, you have movement. You're showing people how passionate you are about this. And it has to come through on a webinar too. But also, they're watching you move. They're watching you speak. They're watching everything about you. The picture is constantly changing. On your webinar, however, all right. On your webinar, you are behind a screen. And so your slides need to be very fast, need to move at a very fast pace. 30 seconds, change slide, change slide, change slide. And they can have just sentences on them. Picture, sentence, picture, picture, sentence, sentence. Big idea, big idea, big idea. To whereas if I'm doing a live presentation for an hour, I might only need 10 slides. If I'm doing a webinar, I'm going to need somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 100, 150 slides for an hour. Okay? That's a major, major difference. Because that presentation, that PowerPoint, or whatever you're doing your presentation through, Keynote, whatever you're using, that is your body language. That is your facial expressions. That is how you show your excitement, along with the inflection in your voice. So you have to really work on that. That slide presentation is everything for your webinar. For your speech, for your live, it's not. It's meaningless, really. You just put a couple big ideas up there. Put a number. Watch a TED Talk. They do a great job. A lot of the TED Talks do a fantastic job with their slides for live presentations. And to go with that, without the body language, it's not as personal. People aren't getting to know it. Webinars are great. They're more personal than a lot of the things that you can do online, but people are just not getting to know you as a person when they are seeing you in a webinar, as well as if they were seeing you up on stage, seeing you in front of them. Maybe there's not a stage. There hasn't been a stage when I talk. You know, I, as a teacher, obviously, standing in front of my students, they would get to know me pretty well. Now, I'm going to stand in front of them 90 times during the year in a block schedule, so they're going to get to know me that way too. But in the first day, there's just a more you know, you're saying hi when they come in the door and stuff like that you can't do. You can do it in a webinar, but it's like, I don't. It just doesn't have the same feel. Webinars have too many distractions. Now, obviously, we know that people can be sitting there and they got the cell phone out and they're maybe halfway listening to you. They're texting their wife, seeing what they need to pick up on the way home. Oh, I have a text message. I didn't even check. All right, I need to check that. I just pulled my phone out. During a podcast, checking my text messages. See how easy it is to get distracted? So when you go on a webinar, you have even more, because they are on the internet. They are sitting there in front of the computer, clicking back and forth, clicking to the other tabs, going through. They're checking their email. They're doing all this stuff. They got text messages out because most people don't want to show you that they're ignoring you in a live presentation, but in a webinar, they know you can't see them, and so they're doing whatever. You lose some of the personal touch. Your audience can be easily distracted. I will say that I think you get a more targeted audience. You get a more committed audience in your live seminars, live presentations, than you would in a webinar. You know, a webinar, like I said, you'll get a lot of looky-loos. People are just kind of checking you out. They don't know if they want to see you or know you or anything like that to begin with. So you're going to get a better targeted audience. I think it's definitely easier if you're selling a high-dollar product. It's probably easier to do that in a live setting, in a live seminar, than it is in a webinar. But again, factor the cost across the board. In a webinar, you don't have the group atmosphere. You can't do things like the old. One of the things that people will do, you know, is have meet the person to the right or the left of you. Um, what was the Zig Ziglar thing that was like 1 out of 3 people are beautiful, something like that. 1 out of every 3 people are beautiful. Look to the left, look to the right. It ain't one of them. So ugly people. I guess if you got ugly people in your seminar, that's true. You might look to the right and see a beautiful woman and realize that you are not the third. So you're gonna get a more targeted audience. You're gonna get people who are more invested in what you have to say. So the disadvantages, it's not as, and this is really all it comes down to. It's not as personal. You're not live. You're not there. They can't see you. They can't see your passion. That means you have to rely more heavily on your presentation slides than you would in a live presentation where they're almost meaningless for you. But your audience is more targeted. So in your webinar, you'll get some people who are kind of iffy about it. In a webinar, they might not be that invested in it. They may not really be ready to buy anything like that. They're going to be easily distracted, like me. I'm easily distracted by everything. But again, I go back to the pros. The cost is incredibly cheap to do a webinar. There are ways to do them for absolutely free. It's not intimidating. You're not standing in front of somebody. Your palms aren't sweating. It's flexible with the scheduling. I can do them anytime. It's easy to get people who are maybe not 100% in on what you're doing to come in and watch. It is easy to record your presentations. You get a big audience. You can record your presentation. You can redistribute it as free or as paid content. You're going to get a lot of interaction in your question and answer. So webinars are great. I don't think they're necessarily better, but I think that you can definitely use webinars. If you're somebody who does a lot of live speaking, I think webinars, you can absolutely translate what you do in your live speaking to your webinars and really, really benefit them. Create profitable webinars. Create great webinars. If you want to create a webinar, you're not sure how to do it, you've never done it before, or you want some ideas for your next one, please go to Webinational.com and download the free video or watch the free video there. I set up a full webinar in 20 minutes. It's actually one that I used. I built it out a little bit after that, but showed you how I set the entire thing up in 20 minutes. You can do it too. You can get going on it. Again, just go to Webinational.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, then please leave us a 5-star review on leave me a 5-star review on iTunes. Really helps to get the word out, and also subscribe to us on iTunes. Thank you so much for listening. You can find the show notes for this episode at Webinational.com/24.